Hello, and welcome again to AI Ramblings with Neal Makwana over there and Michael Parekh here. This is episode 9. Thank you for joining us and liking and subscribing, etc. We've got a jam-packed discussion to talk about over the next half hour today. A lot of stuff has been happening in terms of news of the week, and then we have a main topic that I think will be interesting on a number of fronts for people. I think one of the big news item was, Neal, in your city, because Neal, you're in Austin, Texas, and Elon Musk had his big Robotaxi launch with 10 cars with full supervision and a lot of media coverage. And you're a big fan of that area. We're going to talk more about the whole Robotaxi thing toward the end of the show. But Neal, give us a sense of what was it like this week in Austin in terms of
Yeah,
news of the week.
yeah. So obviously, Austin is a very very bustling city right now for this whole space. Waymo's been launched here for a little over 6 months, I think now. I've had the chance to ride in a couple of Waymos. I didn't get a chance to actually see or ride in any of the Tesla ones. Obviously, it was a limited amount compared to the competitors. But from what I'm seeing online, it seems to have gone fairly smoothly. I think they gave access mostly to people who are pretty big fans of Tesla on Twitter and X and whatnot, obviously in classic Elon fashion.
Fanboys, in other words.
Exactly. So I can't speak as much other than just me seeing some of the videos of rides and whatnot that people had shared. But one thing I can speak to is just this space and how it exists right now in Austin. Number one, if you can get a self-driving car or a car that's being monitored by someone to drive well in Austin during a rush hour, you're doing a pretty decent job, I'd say, because from living here for the last 4 or so years, having to navigate around, it can get really, really hectic and crazy. I was thinking about this while we were preparing for the show. It's rare now that I will go outside and I won't see a Waymo drive by. I mean, the amount of Waymos in the city are so high now to where, yeah.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but my understanding is to call a Waymo, you do it through Uber app in
Yes.
Austin. Unlike the only other place, I think in San Francisco, there is a separate Waymo app. But I think in a
Mhm.
lot of 4 or 5 cities, and they just launched Waymo and Uber in Atlanta. But I think in Atlanta, I'm sorry, in Austin, it's through the Waymo app. So you may want to just touch on that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's funny because
The Uber app, excuse me.
when this started off a couple of months ago, it was only people who had gotten on the wait list. So I had a friend of mine who had gotten on it for a while, and he was the only one that had access. So he'd give us rides through his account. But since it's been opened up to the general public, just like you said, it's only available through the Uber app. But in frustrating fashion, once you ride a Waymo once, you kind of want to do it again and again because it's an amazing experience to where you're able to, number one, obviously the whole thrill of the car being self-driving is a whole different thing, but the actual experience of riding in the car, the ability to change the music, pick what you want to listen to, full control over the AC and whatnot. But these are all not nice to haves. I think when it comes to this type of technology, a lot of people are skeptical because, hey, we're giving full control to an autonomous vehicle. And Waymo has done a really, really good job, in my opinion, of easing the users into this. So whenever you get into the call, there's a voice that speaks to you. It welcomes you into the car, explains you're going to be going from point A to point B. It tells you the interface. There's a screen in the back that allows you to change the music and the temperature of the car. But the most important thing, in my opinion, and I didn't see this in any of the videos of the Tesla Robo Taxis, is there's a back screen on the Waymos that when you're driving, it shows you what the car is seeing. So it shows this LiDAR map. Obviously, there's an array of sensors, LiDAR, and several others on the car that are doing mappings of the
That
environment around it.
importantly, LiDAR is not something that Tesla has because
Yes,
Elon Musk feels very strongly that he can do it on the cheap with just cameras. Important
exactly.
technical point to just highlight. Yeah.
And the benefit of the LiDAR and the way that they've packaged this from a user experience point of view, since that's kind of the area that I'm, hyper focused on, is that it gives you an aerial view of what the car is seeing and what's around the car in a way that kind of welcomes you into, not stepping into this black box of, hey, I'm going to get from point A to point B and I don't know how it's happening. So from actually providing the passenger in the car with a map in real time of the surroundings, it's a live feed. It's not a pre-recorded thing. It's not pre-populating with a map that they have stored in the cloud. It's in real time. I think it's a really, really cool experience. I'm going to try and get my hands, obviously, on a Robo Taxi soon because the Waymo experience has been so much fun, so much to where as you touched on, you can only call this through the Uber app, but annoyingly, there's not a feature to call a Waymo specifically.
Got it.
So a couple of friends of mine have actually, ran into this issue where we want to actually take a Waymo, but it's hard to call a Waymo specifically because it's a toss of a coin. So there are actually little hacks that we've come up with in the filters of when you call a car. And so far, what we figured out to almost get a Waymo every time is that you set a filter to you want an electric car and you want the conversation level to be low. When you do that, obviously the conversation level, there's no one else in the car, so it's always going to be low in a Waymo. And an electric car, these are obviously powered on the Jaguar cars that have been outfitted with this tech. That's the way that we found that's given us the most success to find a Waymo in the
Love it.
city.
That's a
But yeah,
great
it's
Gen Z hack. I love it.
yeah, exactly. So hacking the Waymos. But yeah, I think it's been a great experience, and hopefully, we'll see more of these pop up soon. And awesome.
I think that's terrific. We have a write up on this, on those whole Tesla versus Waymo on the Reset to Zero Substack. It's posted the last couple of days. It'll be in the show notes. So we'll talk a little bit more about this too later in the show as well. But this is very exciting. It's also a big market, stock market type of thing as well, because Tesla was up 10%, $200 billion on this. Google has been flat on all of this. Google's not getting the attention, in my view, that they should get versus Tesla. They're far ahead on this. Elon's just much better at marketing, etc., on this stuff. And this is a thing. I do another podcast, AI Daily, the Daily Rip with Katy Perry and Shai Balur. And Shai and I have a debate going on this topic, and we're going to do a podcast on Monday on this topic. So stay tuned. It's also on my Twitter feed if you want to talk about the rivalry part of it. But it's a fascinating topic. And one of the reasons, Neal, we can't get enough of either one of these cars on the road is because there aren't enough. They're still all in a testing mode, although Google has hundreds of cars, 250,000 rides a week versus Robotaxi just getting started with 10 cars with supervising drivers in the passenger seat, not drivers, but people in the front seat from Tesla. So they are behind. They've got a long way to go relative to Google. Anyway, interesting topic. The other news of the week is we have been on this show talking a lot about how AI really depends on not just the large language models, etc., but a lot of the software glue for developers to be able to plug into these models, etc. Google took a big step on this week with something called Gemini CLI for command line interface. It's a big set of connectivity for millions of developers to connect to Google's models that run on their own TPU architecture, which is very robust. And there's a lot. Sounds a lot in technical form. It's a little detailed, but what it means is Google in general is absolutely keeping in pace, maybe even lapping ahead of companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, etc., who also have world-class models, world-class compute. OpenAI in partnership with Microsoft Azure, Anthropic in partnership with Amazon AWS, and Google. But Google is with CLI. There's a lot of bells and whistles that make life so much easier and cheaper for the developers. We've written it all up in a post yesterday, which you can look up on post number 762. But that was another major news of the week from our perspective that we wanted to underline.
Exactly. And but before we move on to some of our main topics, I think this whole idea of the cost being brought down is so important because something that I'm going to talk about a bit later in my obsession of the week. I've been using Dia, as we mentioned a couple episodes ago, by the browser company who formerly made Arc. I've been using Arc for years, and I finally made the shift over to Dia. And the great thing about Dia is, obviously it's an AI first browser. So unlike the approach that Google and Chrome have taken currently, to where it's kind of been bolted on as the side feature, where it almost feels like an extension, here they've done a really good job of baking it in with several things like skills and whatnot, where you're able to use these / terminal like command like shortcuts to quickly get information about what you're looking at on your screen, make comparisons of different items when you're shopping, get ratings and reviews of a restaurant you're looking at. I'll do a demo a bit later where I kind of walk through some of my favorite skills that I've made on the platform. But with stuff like this, obviously there's so much compute involved. You're constantly making prompts. The browser company, I'm sure, is racking up a lot in compute. And with stuff like Gemini CLI, where the compute overhead is being brought down a bit, I'm sure this is great news for any company in that space. So just wanted to highlight that before we move on.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you. Our main topic of this show, episode 9, is really a big presentation that renowned AI guru named Andrei Karpathy had. He presented it at Y Combinator, which is the Harvard Business School of AI and technology startups in San Francisco. He presented to over 3,000 of the best and brightest tech entrepreneurs in America. And its presentation was titled Software is Changing Again. We've got some slides. It's a big deck. We'll have links in the show notes for the full deck. And we just wanted to highlight a couple of things that he talked about. But for those of you who don't know Andrei Karpathy, he was a co-founder, one of the 8 people who co-founded OpenAI almost a decade ago. He was the head for about half a decade of Tesla's auto-driving car effort for Elon Musk. So what we were talking about earlier. He is a programmer's programmer. He has millions of followers online and does these super tutorials on AI for developers and for regular people who care. So he's a very well-known communicator around what's going on in AI at the software level. And he had this presentation titled Software in the Era of AI. Neal, I think we have it on the deck, but he's famous for a couple of very pithy sayings in the tech world. Number one, and this is pinned on his Twitter feed, is that he said, a couple of years ago, which has been very true, that the hottest new programming language in the world is English. Regular people like us can now increasingly just talk to ChatGPT and Google Gemini and etc., and it can increasingly it'll create custom programs for us. Today in 2025, you still need some technical skills to put it all together. But we're on this path where there's a fundamental shift in 25, 30 years in terms of the accessibility of programming. And then the other thing he's very famous for is this term vibe coding. He put it out a few months ago. It's just swept Silicon Valley. You can't talk to a startup now without vibe coding come up. And there's a fairly detailed definition of this. But the core thing he's talking about is that you can now casually code with the assistance of AI. Almost every big and small tech company now talks about how 20, 30, 40% of their code is written by AI. What they mean is that the AI helps them generate a little ton of code, then the programmers then clean it up, check it, because there's always hallucinations, and then use it to just turbocharge, leverage how they can move forward. It's like, walking, as Steve Jobs used to say, the computer is a bicycle for the mind. AI coding is a bicycle for programmers. And so that is why this is very interesting in terms of how Andrei framed it. But the core thing ideas that he talks about in the presentation is the next slide, Neal, if we could go to that, which is that software is changing. Again, this is a follow-up presentation to what he's done. And he basically talks about how we are now in the third stage of software changing in AI, where with ChatGPT, we had this business of typing in chat code, etc. And then the large language models basically were employed over the last 6, 7, 8 years with transformers to mimic the human mind and in terms of these so-called neural nets. And they're doing probabilistic weights of how the world looks rather than the deterministic software where you say 1 + 3 is 4. And so the answer is always 4 with no hallucinations. In this approach, you may get an answer 5 20% of the time, but it's doing it through looking at all the calculations done by people and then through probabilistic weights figuring out what that answer is. And then the third stage that we're in, which is this business of prompting, where people like us, whenever we query ChatGPT, the system is doing constant matrix math, algorithmic probabilistic math to come up with the right answer. And so he's got a good diagram on it, which I think is the next slide, Neal, which is that we're at the 3.0 thing, which is what Neal has been talking a lot about of late on our shows, where we talk about AI browsing and how the UI UX is changing, user interface, user experience, and that is fundamentally changing. He goes on in the rest of his slides with a lot of technical detail, which, Neal, I think you have a lot of thoughts on. So let me hand it to you to take it from
Yeah.
here on
So this
3.0.
this is a great segue kind of to our next slide. We've talked about before how, over over the course of technology, there have been several interfaces for people to interact with. Obviously, it started off with the terminal interface. I, of course, was not around for that, but I've heard plenty about it. We then moved on to touch with stuff like the iPhone. I mean, everyone's lives were changed whenever this technology was put in our back pockets. And now we've kind of reached this third phase of almost a return to this terminal-like experience with chat, with these chatbots. You're able to interact with these models using chat, but Andre does a really good job of pointing out that the right GUIs kind of haven't probably been invented yet. We're at this point right now where a lot of companies are bolting on chatbots to their existing platforms, and he talks about it a bit later, and I'll wait until we get to that. But he brings up this idea about how GUIs are going to have to be custom made for specific applications and uses. How this chat interface, although it's a really intuitive way for us to interact, almost this conversational like experience, for it to bring true value and feel like, it's just magic. I mean, I think it's going to have to be changed a bit, and he believes it too. He has a really great slide next where he talks about how it's a pretty complicated slide visually, but the main thing we want to focus on is this middle area here. How typically technology has always been government, corporations, consumers. That's kind of been the flow of technology. How things usually start off as a government project. There's endless examples of things that have started off as a government project, and they get passed on to corporations, and finally into the hands of the consumers. But recently, this is not a super recent shift, but it's definitely apparent to most people in this advent of AI, where consumers are kind of the starting point with these LLMs. Consumers are creating really cool use cases through these apps. These are being passed on to corporations, and then finally into a government space. And he has several examples here, as I said in the past: electricity, cryptography, computing, flight, internet, GPS. These all started off as government projects and finally got into the hands of the consumers. But we're in this really interesting point now where the tables have been turned, and the consumers are the ones creating these new use cases for technology. Moving on to the next slide. This is a really interesting thing, and I know we've talked about it a bit off camera, but this whole idea of LLMs being people spirits, these kind of stochastic simulations of people, is a really, really interesting way. I think Andre does a really good job, obviously, of coining these phrases and putting these really complex ideas into ways that people can understand easily. He did it with vibe coding. He's done it with several other things in the past, but I think he does a really cool job of explaining the emergent psychology of these LLMs. Obviously, we're all familiar with these hallucinations that happen. This is a psychological term, but when it comes to AI, hallucinations are when, a model will output something that's completely made up out of thin air. It has no basis in any of the facts that it has in its data. But he moves on to bring up a term I actually had not heard about, but it's anterograde amnesia, which is this idea of people not being able to retain short-term new information, that it's made it difficult. It's a real life condition that exists in people where they have a hard time retaining new information, which in turn helps causes a lot of difficulty in forming long-term memory. And this is something, that has been discussed endlessly. I mean, Sam Altman has made it a mission to talk about in several of his interviews that he's done recently, that he sees AI moving in the way of context, how ideally there will just be one, a SLM or an LLM that people can have with them that has their entire context. It knows their email, it knows about their personal history, and you're able to call upon it for any task that you might need. So framing this AI in a way of this this psychological model, I think is really interesting, and I think there's a lot of really cool discussion to be had on it.
Okay, I just wanted to add one piece here, which is very important from the way I look at it. I think it's extraordinarily important for billions of people as they do AI work. It's unfortunate that we have put AI in the context of human thinking. We're anthropomorphizing AI, that this is human. And these are not human things. These are computers. We're using extraordinary amount of computing in a fundamentally different way. And I think Andre talks about that. But my concern is with words like people spirits is I rather think about it as the essence of human knowledge online. Because what AI does is essentially hoover up everything digitally in every language imaginable and converts it into massive statistical table, which is that fancy word stochastic, and creates these massive probabilistic tables. And it's just pulling up relative to queries answers to this. There is nothing human about this. There is no thinking. These words like thinking, psychology, I have a problem with the anthropomorphizing this stuff. And so I just pointed out because as we're at the beginning stages of this, we should be thinking about these things no different than the computers we have used for 70 years. They've just helped us do a lot of things. It's just like if I can walk and run, and then if I'm in a Boeing 787 or even the supersonic aircraft, that doesn't mean that the aircraft is now superhuman. It's just I'm using a tool. And I point this out because the people's spirits is the essence of human knowledge. It's basically all the knowledge that we have just made super duper accessible through language models. And that's where we are, and we're at the beginning stages of that. So I just wanted to say, instead of people's spirits, I like to think of it as the essence of human knowledge. And that is what these systems are working on and we're figuring out the user interface, user experience on how to access and pull it out of these machines a lot more efficiently, which is what goes to things like AI browsers, which Neal is going to talk about in a lot more detail. So I just wanted to underline this point here. We can go
No,
to the next slide.
it's very true. And moving on to the next slide, kind of building on this idea that I touched on a bit earlier with application specific GUI. Again, there's a lot going on in this slide. I want to focus kind of on this bottom right hand corner with this idea of an autonomy slider. With a lot of these AIs, there's been this change in the interfaces where you can tell it, you want to be a bit funnier, you want to be a bit more serious, you want to have more detail, you want to be more vague. And adding this idea of an autonomy slider, whether it's in an area like, here he's focused on perplexity and search, so where you can side between searching, researching, and deep research. But there's also this idea of how much control you want to also give over to this AI. He has this analogy a bit later with this idea of AI being very similar to Tony Stark's Iron Man suit. And essentially, I know we're going to touch on it a bit, but I think it's really cool to preface here is that, and if anyone's seen, the Iron Man or Marvel movies, that, Tony has this suit of armor he's built around himself with an AI called Jarvis, and he's able to ask Jarvis to do things for him, like bring up a map or call someone, but he's also able to take full control when he wants of the machinery in the suit, to fire things, to fly around, to fight people. And that's kind of what Andre is trying to say here, is that we should look at AI almost as this Iron Man suit, to where you should have a slider to where you can choose when you want to be fully hands-on with it. You can also choose when you want to give it some autonomy to complete tasks for you. And that's kind of this whole agentic trend we've seen, obviously, in AI browsers with things like Dia. They've shown in some of their marketing for Dia that eventually there'll be a way to send an agent to do a task for you while you go and get a cup of water. It'll be able to compile a list from a shopping list that you have or do other tasks. So this autonomy slider idea is really interesting. So we wanted to make sure we highlight that. And that kind of goes into our next slide about how there is a new category of consumer or manipulator of digital information. Obviously, we started off with humans and GUIs, computers and APIs. And now we have this new thing where we have agents, which are computers, but they're slightly human-like. Obviously, we just discussed how putting a human-like framing over these might not be the most efficient way to look at it, because we want to realize, obviously, that these are computers that in the end are just doing probabilistic modeling of outcomes. But this whole idea of agents is really interesting. Moving on, he gets a bit technical, but the reason I wanted to focus on this was for this idea of agents. Obviously, I did my undergrad in computer engineering here at
And
UT
masters, and
and
masters,
masters
two
and masters
degrees.
in data science. Exactly. So I've obviously had a lot of experience with the technical side of things, and I think it's really interesting the way he's laid this out. We've talked about this in the past, how the internet is breaking, with the traditional SEO that we've gotten used to with Google, and these ad tech models are changing because of these AI summaries and AI recommendations that are coming up in search, and how SEO needs to be rethought, not only from the perspective of how you search, because people are getting a lot more natural in the way that they're able to finally search with things like Perplexity and obviously Comet, which will be releasing soon, which is Perplexity's take on an AI browser. The reason I bring all that up is when it comes to these agents that are, scraping these websites to bring you information quickly and clutter free, they're having to go through these really complex, website layouts. Traditionally it's HTML. But Andre brings up this idea of us potentially having to shift over to having .txt files instead, that are basically these markdown. Anyone that's familiar with code, you've heard about markdown files, and whether it's a Python notebook, we're essentially able to easily format and annotate, almost similar to a Word doc. It's this uniform kind of file where all the information and text you have laid out is in a very specific format and formula. And he essentially proposes this idea of adding TXT files to all websites to make it easier for agents to scrape and find information. And the example that he uses is really cool. It's this idea of git ingest. So typically, whenever you go to a GitHub repository here on the left, you find the interface that GitHub has designed where you have various folders in a directory and you can dive in and see the code files. But Karpathy talks about this idea of a website called Git Ingest that's been created where you can easily, here you're able to put in a directory that you want and you can hit ingest and it'll give you a directory structure, but then you can download the contents of this as a TXT file, which then can be easily exported and fed into a model to help understand in a very uniform and easy to understand way what the format of the code base is in this example. So this idea of making the internet more accessible for AIs, this whole machine to machine interaction that we've kind of shifted towards in the last year or so, is a really interesting shift, and it'll be cool to see how it's tackled moving forward. And obviously ending off with a nice graphic of the Iron Man suit that I touched on a bit earlier, this idea of augmentation versus an agent, and having this slider to be able to modulate how much control we give. And that's kind of all we had for these slides. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to bring up regarding
Yes,
this.
so I think this was terrific summary of a much larger deck. Again, we'll have the deck in the show notes if we want to go into the weeds. There's also the video presentation that Andrei himself makes, but we want to pull out these topics. But I'd like to make 2 points. Number one, underlining what Neal said, that look, the software part of this is very exciting for developers, both in terms of the way we've done this traditionally for 70 years and now the new ways we can do this through the probabilistic stuff, number one. Number two, it's very gunky. Today's internet is not built for AI and agents. We have to rebuild it. I did a big post on this a few weeks ago, which I will have in the show notes under this part of the topic if you want to look at all of that. But the point, that is what Andrei is saying, that, and if you listen to his whole presentation, as excited he is about all these things that are happening, that is so amazing for developers and ultimately for users, billions of users who are going to get lots of cool AI things to do. It's a long road. And that gets into this other topic that I also wanted to underline, that there is a mismatch, a gap of expectations. Today's users, because AI has been so much in the news, the media has been talking about it, billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars are being invested. Everyone is kind of expecting, including companies and at the boardroom level, that, they're spending so much money on AI that all these advantages all these amazing Jarvis-like agents and so on are going to happen right around the corner. And Andrei makes the point both directly and indirectly, which I think is important to underline. It's going to take longer than we think. I've written about this constantly, etc. I also wanted to point to another presentation and a post by an AI developer, Nat B. Jones, who has very good AI stuff on out there that you can subscribe to. We'll again have it in the show notes, where he talks specifically about there is a gap between what people like Andrei Karpathy are saying about the way the software is and what companies like McKinsey, who are advising the biggest and best companies in America and the world about how AI is coming. There's a big McKinsey report this week as well that talks about how this is imminent and this is going to change everything in companies, which is all true. It's just that the expectation set over there on the McKinsey side, on the business side, is far sooner. I saw this professionally when I was a former partner at Goldman. I headed up Goldman's internet research in the 90s. Same thing happened. When people got excited about the internet, it took a couple of years, but after the whole world wanted to do internet and be internet. But it took 20 years for the internet to be robust enough with the broadband, etc., to do all the cool things we do on it today. Everyone back then thought it would happen in 5 years. The same thing's going on now with AI. And I wanted to highlight that and underline that. That's why I want to give you all some resources to go look at to just settle in that and see that this stuff is going. There is a widening gap right now between expectations of what this AI stuff will do and how long it's going to take software developers, the millions of people that Andrei's talking about, young, amazing folks like Neal here, who actually have to do the gunky work of making the software do all these things. It's going to take a while, folks. So be patient. There'll be cool things for us every quarter or gadgets. We'll talk about it, etc. But it's going to take a while, but it's going to be a very fun ride. So that is our main topic today. I just wanted to underline all of that, those two key points. And now let's talk about some of the other core features before we wind it up. A read of the week. Neal, you had a read of the week, and I have a book I just finished, which I wanted to underline.
Yeah, I can go ahead and kick it off. So The Verge recently did this an array of articles regarding how AI is going to impact, art and traditional creative spaces, whether it's video, photography, editing, and whatnot. And they have a nice folder that I'll link below in the show notes. But the one I wanted to focus on was this article titled "What Happens When AI Comes for Our Fonts?" And it essentially outlined, it's a very in-depth article, and I encourage everyone to go and look at it. But from a high level, a lot of the value is found at the beginning where they're talking about a company called Monotype, this design company that owns a lot of the fonts that we use every day: Helvetica, Futura, Gill Sans, among 250,000 other fonts. And they have a report every year, and this year's revision report, as they call it, outlining the trends in the typography space that they published in February. They devote an entire chapter essentially to how AI will achieve changes in typography. And the reason I wanted to highlight it, I'll go into what they said in a second, is I think a lot of people right now, when they hear about AI and they're in a creative space, they get a bit worried that their work is going to get stolen or reproduced because it's being fed into these models. And this whole idea of AI is going to just steal my font in this case and just reproduce it without giving me any credit, or AI will take my place. It'll be able to generate fonts off of me just giving it a prompt. While that'll happen in some extent, this report does a really interesting job of showing how AI can be used as a tool to help elevate from a user experience point of view. The quote I wanted to focus on is essentially how they say that reactive typography will leverage emotional and psychological data to tailor itself to the reader. It might bring text into focus when you look at it and soften your gaze when it drifts. It could also shift typefaces depending on the time of day and light level around you. And it could also adapt to reading speeds and emphasize important portions of online text for greater engagement. Now, what does this mean? I mean, my mom, some of her friends, a lot of them have the text font level on their iPhone turned up all the way, turned up and bolded, because, as you get older, obviously your eyesight begins to fade a bit and it's harder. Obviously, we're always looking at these screens all the time, every day, and you find yourself squinting a lot to look at the information. And by default, a lot of people just want their fonts turned up all the way. What this article is kind of outlining, or I guess what this report is outlining, is how all this data is already being collected on a local level by companies like Apple here. They added in a couple years ago this accessibility feature where if you have your phone too close to your face, it'll give you a warning. It's not good for your eyes. They're collecting all this data. They're using the sensors on the phone to see how far away you are. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is this article does a good job of reframing how AI can take all of this data that it already has on device from you locally. It's not being sent anywhere. It's all encrypted on device, and use it to modify what you're seeing on your screen. Apple made big leaps and bounds, obviously, with Vision Pro and how they're allowing you to interact with text, use your eyes to track stuff. The whole way they're able to achieve this with no handheld devices, because it's using the data from your eyes, where you're looking. If you blink, what are you looking at? You can click to select stuff just by your gaze. They're going to be able to take this technology to hopefully a mobile level, to where if you're looking at an article and you're looking at a specific line, it'll be able to enlarge that text itself. That's what this report is kind of outlining about how AI will be used to modify the things on your screen. Also stuff like, the time of day. Obviously, a lot of people have dark mode and light mode. But between that, there's a large array of levels of light, glare, and whatnot, to where the text can be enhanced. And it's just a really cool report. We'll link it down below. It goes very in depth, as I said, but it's this whole conversation of how AI will help transform these user interfaces we've been using for years now.
I think it's an excellent example of how software and these gadgets are going to be really helping us be superhuman, as it were, without having to have a Jarvis suit, basically. And a similar example, Apple last year with these AirPods. Today, they already are being updated with better hearing. So you can now literally adjust your hearing in a room and listen to things further away, etc. So the software and AI can help you augment your surrounding. It's one of the five senses, hearing. And what, Neal, you're talking about is the seeing part of it in the context of whether it's through
Exactly.
phones and glasses and smart glasses, Vision Pro, and our phones themselves. So
And before we move on, one other thing, I mean, this also touches on what we've talked about in the past. Everyone loves to say that Apple's behind on AI, but the thing is, Apple's doing a lot of AI without calling it AI. All these things are machine learning models, artificial intelligence. It may not be these traditional LLMs that people are so accustomed to seeing now, but in the end of the day, Apple's been doing so much of this and just not labeling it. I mean, they're not even they're calling it Apple Intelligence. So they're obviously not wanting to lean into it from that point of view, but this just shows that a lot of people aren't seeing where the real value is with this tech.
excellent point. I've been on all the market shows I go to, I talk about how Apple is not at all behind. And in fact, it's actually of the Mag 7s, it's down 20% relative to its peers, which it shouldn't be because of just this point. And even Apple Intelligence, it gets a lot of derision out there in terms of the reviews and so on, because Apple had to define a certain thing a certain way. But there's a lot of the things you talked about, are talking about, they have nothing to do with Apple Intelligence. It's just machine learning. It's just probabilistic computing that's going into their devices and operating systems. But they're not going to jazz it up that way. The market, because they're so AI focused, like it's 96 in terms of internet, they're not understanding it, they're not digesting it. Anyway, it's a good point there. My read of the week, just to kind of, because we're running a tad over, my read of the week is the second of two books on Nvidia and Jensen Huang. Why? This is a 31-year plus company. It overnight success, 3 decades. Jensen Huang, I've dealt with him for decades in the context of his the role of Nvidia as a massively important graphics company for computing. And in the last 10 years, he's reformed the company, obviously, to provide the core AI infrastructure, the GPUs to run today's AI infrastructure. His chips and software are 80 to 90% of what we make the AI happen that we talk about around the world. And I've got a whole bunch of posts that say they're basically in a extraordinary position over the next few years on this. The company obviously has been very successful. Last 2 or 3 years, they went from being worth a few $100 billion to over $3 trillion. On any given day, they're neck and neck with Microsoft and Apple at the $3 billion. The reason I point out these two books, the one is The Nvidia Way, which was out a few months ago. Great book if you're interested in the topic. The second one, which I just finished, called Thinking Machines by Stephen Witt, and also worth a read. This last book I particularly like because Jensen, particularly toward the last chapter, he came across and basically addressed a big elephant in the room where almost all of the co-founders of AI companies have been for 5, 6, 7, 10 years, and even today talk about some of the existential possible risks of AI that, because we have been so brainwashed with science fiction, negative science fiction, Terminator movies, all these kinds of dystopian science fiction, going back almost 100 years of how AI and machine learning and robots can essentially kill us. Jensen is a technologist. There's a wonderful scene in the last chapter where the author is talking to him as his final interview and asks him about these existential risks. And Jensen basically looks at him and says, I'm a scientist. That's not how I think about it. You should go read the science. I'm paraphrasing. Read the science fiction for entertainment. Watch the movies. It has nothing to do with how AI is being built today. It is one of the things that I think needs to be said by the core founders and technologists a lot more. And it's wonderful to see a person like Jensen Huang with his credibility to say it out loud, say it front and center, that some of this existentialism around AI, because we're so brainwashed with science fiction, enough of that. This stuff is just technology. Yes, it's going to be used for some bad things and good things. It started with fire from Prometheus's tale. It's going to continue with this. But net, this is a very good thing for the world economy, etc. And we should be bottom up pragmatic about it. And so I would highlight this book if you want to learn more about how NVIDIA got to here. Okay,
Wonderful.
last place is Obsession of the Week.
Yeah.
Neal?
So I hinted at it a bit earlier. Let me get it all pulled up, but it's this recurring theme. I've been doing a lot of deep work on AI browsers, especially, with the browser company Nvidia. Obviously, Perplexity is going to be hopefully releasing comments soon. We get our hands on that. Chrome has obviously been adding Gemini stuff slowly but surely into their offerings. But I've focused on Nvidia because I'm really excited about what they're doing. I think they've done a really good job of just rethinking from the ground up what it means to be an AI browser, this kind of first principles approach. There's a lot of good interviews that a couple of the designers have done. I can link them down below, and they have a Medium article that was written by one of their head product designers outlining their approach for this redesign. Because a lot of the people that use the browser company before was using it as Arc, and there's been kind of a hesitation to shift over to Dia. And this is all stuff that they're kind of just in publishing to help people understand why they made the shift and how it'll be beneficial in the long run. I completely buy into it. I've been using Dia for I think 2 or 3 weeks now, ever since I got access, and it's completely changed the way I use the internet. But I'll go ahead and do a quick demo here just to kind of show this idea of skills. So this is one of the main offerings of Dia from an AI point of view, where you're able to program what they're calling skills. It's essentially similar to how Apple released Apple Shortcuts a couple, or I guess Siri Shortcuts as they called it a couple of years ago, where you can automate. It's almost this if this then that programming style of, if I type in this small prompt, trigger this larger prompt, in this case of actions that can be taken. So I'm going to quickly start here by the homepage of Dia, and if you go into this little drop down here, you're able to see some of the skills that I've made. I'm going to go ahead and drop into this just to show you guys the process of making a skill. My first skill that I have is backslash summary. So this is ideally, you can see it in my prompt here. So what you do is when I prefix a query with backslash summary, run the following prompt. And this is my full prompt that I wouldn't want to type out every time. I've said, give me an in-depth summary of this. By this, I mean what I'm looking at currently. It does a great job of understanding the context of your screen and what you're doing, and it scrapes it using a variety of backend services to then provide you with what you're asking for. Another one that I have, another two that I use all the time, this idea of deep research that OpenAI has in their models. This is kind of just a hack together, bootstrapped deep research that I had built myself inside of Dia, where whenever I type backslash insights, I ask for new and original insights based on this that I can use in a discussion about the topic. So it's really deep insights that I originally may have not gotten from a summary. Similarly, I can do this with backslash questions. So give me new and original questions based on this that I can use in a discussion about the topic. Essentially, these are just ways for me to quickly get insights and questions that sometimes I might have not thought about based on the context of what I'm seeing. Another thing that I use, and I'll demo this one here in a second, these two specifically, is backslash headlines, which gives me the top headlines from today from two of the publications that I check a lot every morning, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And then backslash reviews, which will give me reviews of whatever restaurant I'm looking at from websites like, obviously, as I mentioned earlier with our whole Waymo discussion, I'm in Austin. So these are some of the main publications I go to. Eater.austin.com and theinfatuation.com are two sites that have done a lot of really cool reviews and ratings of restaurants in Austin. I've also added on this prompt of give me the best items to order. So we'll start off here in the Dia, the main search bar that you're served up whenever you launch it. And I'll, go ahead and do backslash. One second, let me just get my keyboard to start here. Backslash headlines. And whenever I hit enter on this, Dia goes and scrapes my publications that I've given it and gives me the top headlines from the New York Times and then the top headlines from the Wall Street Journal. Not only does it do this, but then it gives me a link for me to read more about these. So these are our top headlines from today from the New York Times and the top headlines from today from the Wall Street Journal. And then if I want to learn a bit more, I can just click here, be taken to the homepage where it's scraped all of this to give me a summary of the top headlines. And this is important because, a lot of people be like, why wouldn't you just use the Apple News app? Why wouldn't you just use a traditional app that synthesizes all of your news into one? It's because this idea that Josh from the browser company has touched on, that without realizing, the browser has kind of become a lot of people's operating system for their computer. You do so much on your browser. You send emails, you do video calls, you consume content. And without realizing it, the browser has a lot of context based on our search history and whatnot about who we are as people and what we're interested in. So they've kind of turned this idea of tabs from being this, cluttered interface of, I have 100 tabs open, to reframing this tabs being this almost like an oil for the car to run on. It's this oil, is a source of data for the browser to learn more about you. And so this is one example of backslash headlines that I use all the time. Another example can be here. So I'm actually, right after this call, I'm about to go grab lunch with a friend. And we're going to this local spot in Austin close to campus called Food Heads. So I'm going to go and do a search for Food Heads, go to foodheads.com. And let's say I hadn't been here before, or I wanted to kind of get an idea of what's this restaurant? What are the best things? What are people saying about it? I can quickly pull up from here, this top corner here, chat, and I can go ahead and do backslash reviews. And as you saw earlier, I've created this like recipe, almost, no pun intended, of a prompt that I want to pull up. And based on this, it checks the publications I trust. So Eater Austin, it gives me a review that is regularly featured, on their list of best sandwiches and affordable dining in Austin. Obviously, I'm a student, so I don't want to spend too much. And it gives me a link to the source, which is super useful for me to see where it comes from. It gives me a TripAdvisor snapshot, the rating and how many reviews, and then it gives me some testimonials from the website itself. But the thing I always have a hard time doing when I get to a restaurant is picking what I want to get. So I added into the prompt, give me what to order. Whenever I go here and into how I personalized it, I have give me the best items to order. So because of that, here it serves up, this is what is recommended based on a variety of the menu and also the reviews that other people have given. That this, and surprisingly enough, I'm a regular here, and this is what I always get. I get the apple pork sandwich. So this is not a hallucination. This is not them just making up stuff or randomly picking from the menu. These are curated options that are recommended to you, and I think this is great. I mean, what would have taken me multiple searches, multiple tabs, I would have had to search, Food Heads and Austin reviews, or gone to another a review site I trust, like Eater in this case, and read up on it myself. The browser goes and does it all for me. And there's so many times that I've caught myself doing this traditional search experience, and I've had to kind of check myself while I'm doing it and say, this can be done a lot easier. Let me open up chat and just ask through this interface. So those are just a couple of the skills. Obviously, I use Dia. I mean, this is the app I guess I use the most throughout all my devices, because it's kind of become this centralized hub for me to do everything. And I can't wait to see what they do next with Dia.
Terrific demonstration. We've also talked a lot about what's this AI stuff breaking the internet in terms of the today's business models. I'm watching your presentation and I'm like, the skills, for instance, right now, these are skills you've created, but I can totally see a third market
An app
developing
store for
for skills. App
skills,
store,
exactly.
but like famous celebrities or foodies could create their own set of skills and market them. I'll subscribe to them, right? If there was an Anthony Bourdain, bless his soul, set of skills on picking the best menus in any given city, I mean, that would be a business right there.
Yes.
So the business models come from these capabilities. And as people's habits change, how we think about browsers to now AI browsers, this will change as well. Neal, AI browsers, I'm sorry, they're not an obsession of the week for you. They're an obsession. Keep it going.
Yeah.
We love it. And it's great to see how you're thinking about it, not just as a front-end user, but obviously with your tech background, understanding how this stuff can be more real. So that's
Exactly.
terrific. My obsession of the week, I'm going to just touch on it today because we've gone a little bit over on time, but I've been in the weeds a lot this week of operating systems that are changing. We've talked a lot about Apple and iOS in terms of our WWDC coverage and so on, how iOS 26 is going to change a lot of things. The other big operating system families are obviously Google's Chrome, Chrome OS, and Android. And so I've gone back to all of my devices, and there are some new ones out that are really starting to incorporate a lot of this AI, especially from Google with Gemini, etc. And I've been in the weeds of trying to figure out how my experience of Chromebooks, of Android tablets, and Android phones, of course, are fundamentally changing because of what just dozens of, going to hundreds of things that Google is doing to fold AI into the experience. Just like what Neal pointed out with Dia, we're starting to see that Google do that, again, leveraging not only their software stack with things like Chrome browsers that Neal obviously has been talking about, but Chrome OS, which is in these devices, Android, which is all in the all the 70% of the smartphone market that are Android run around the world. And so there's a lot to come here. So that's another obsession that I wanted to underline as my obsession of the week. And we'll talk more about it in subsequent shows. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you again for joining us for episode 9. We'll be back again next week with number 10. Again, as usual, we love the cards and letters, as it were. Likes, subscribes, always appreciated. Thank you for joining us. And as always, stay tuned.
See you next time. Thanks.